The protagonist is running hastily, until he stops for a moment, but only to realize that a large arrow hits one of his legs. When he receives the arrow shot, he cannot help but scream in pain. In tears, he quickly goes to the lobby, but halfway ends up falling, as it is difficult for him to stand up, just when he just lost one of his legs, wondering if this is really his true end, cursing with all his being, that if that strange window had not appeared while he was having a couple of beers, and even worse, if he had not chosen the maximum difficulty, he would not have to go through all this. Continuing screaming from an intense pain, he apparently says his last words, telling himself that he does not want to die. We find ourselves in the protagonist's room with the name of Lee Ho-jae, drinking a couple of beers while he watches TV. He tells us that previously he was a former professional video game player, who basically made a living at it. But all that changed, until a gamer came along and managed to beat the protagonist, but not only that, he also managed to destroy his pride. The protagonist of such frustration, decided to retire at a very young age, having only 26 years old, so now without knowing what to do with his life, spends the rest of his days in deep boredom. To peek into his television, come some news in which cases have been reported, of appearances of sudden subway holes, in which the government is trying to investigate this strange phenomenon. But suddenly a strange window pops up in front of our protagonist, being written an invitation to participate in a kind of tutorial, so the protagonist, without knowing what the hell is happening, wonders if it's some kind of video game or he had too many beers, and presses the accept button, and then displays the difficulty level in which he would like to pass the tutorial. The protagonist, still retaining his spirit of professional video game player, without being intimidated, chooses the infernal difficulty. Suddenly the protagonist opens his eyes, but to find that he is in a kind of white room with two people in front of him, wondering where the hell he is, so a blonde guy answers that they are on the second floor of the tutorial. The protagonist could not believe what he was seeing. And an older man says that everyone arrived when they received that strange message from an interface as if it were a video game, but on one side there is also a girl besides them three. The gentleman tells the prota to calm down since all of them are confused just like him. The prota thinks it is strange that now he no longer feels drunk from the alcohol, and the gentleman comments to him that, in this waiting room, their bodies have the ability to regenerate, and tells him that could be the reason why the prota no longer feels drunk, and comments to him that, if he has not yet chosen his weapon. But at that very moment a window appears in front of the prota, telling him to select his weapon. Suddenly he is teleported to a kind of armament, so he gets ready to choose his weapon, which, thanks to his knowledge of video games, he takes into account what weapon would suit him or weapons that have a great disadvantage in him, deducing his physique and his skills in real life. After a deep analysis he decides to choose a sword with a shield, but it turns out that they are used weapons and are very worn, so much that they are about to break, for something must be the maximum difficulty, and then the system confirms if you are sure of your choice, so the prota without option chooses yes. After a few seconds he is sent back to the waiting room. The man tells him what weapons he chose, and after seeing the prota's weapons, he explains the basics of his profile, showing him that each of them have a window of their inventories, and the prota decides to do the same and tries to save the weapon he chose in his inventory. Then the master shows him his stats bar, observing that the prota has too low stats. And finally the master explains to the prota that there is a tab called community, since they are not the only ones who were sent to the tutorial, and it is a chat window, where they can help each other. But seeing the amount of people in each difficulty they realize that they are the only people who belong to the infernal lobby. After a brief presentation between them, a window is displayed where it says that there are 70 hours left for the tutorial to begin, so the main character tells his team that these 3 remaining days, before the tutorial begins, they should train and choose the role they will play in the battlefield. After a few minutes each of them start to train, to familiarize themselves with their weapon. While the blonde hair is fighting with the master, the protagonist comments that one of them should be the leader of this team, so the girl tells him that she thought he was the leader of the group. 3 days have passed, the time has come for them to enter the tutorial, and ready, 4 portals appear, destined for each player to enter the one that corresponds to him. They were all confused, thought that the tutorial would be done in teamwork, but it turns out that it is not so. But before being sent, the protagonist dictates some words to his teammates, and is, to make sure they return alive. The prota, when he is already in the tutorial, does not cease to feel a great emotion, since he finally began to feel the same feeling when he played video games, but when he turns around he realizes that the portal is still open, and inside it there is a window that says, if you want to return to the waiting room, so the prota feels surprised and decides to return, to see if he is actually able to return to the lobby. And indeed he had returned back to the lobby, but a window appeared with a time marker for him to return to the lobby, but apparently he was not the only one who had returned, and the girl suddenly bumps into the protagonist, so he embarrassedly comments to the protagonist that it would be good if the other two guys returned. After waiting an hour to see that neither of the two boys had returned, they decide to return to the tutorial, but the girl wants to ask a request from him to the protagonist, that when they return he will teach her to play, and then proceeds to give a kiss to the protagonist, and comments that when she returns she would like to know more about him, and these two are teleported back to the tutorial. The prota now had a purpose to come back alive, and he goes into defense mode and decides to walk through the corridor, but after walking 30 minutes later, he found it strange that no enemy had appeared, so he wondered if it's some kind of error or bug, but he decides not to let his guard down and decides to stay focused. But out of nowhere a window appears where it says that he has gained 2 passive skills, which are concentration on the battlefield and willpower at level 1, and the prota realizes that he is able to gain skills in this tutorial. But suddenly a strong dark wind suddenly appears and permeates the whole hallway. The prota, just feeling the atmosphere, can't help but feel afraid. But apparently he sees a weird light in the distance, but only to realize that it is heading towards him. The prota, upon receiving such an impact, does not stop feeling an agonizing pain, at the same time thinking, what will have happened, and decides to return to the lobby crawling. But another burst of light hits near him. The prota realizes that they are really arrows. While receiving a few bursts of arrows, comes out a few messages of increased pain tolerance. The prota, without energy, receives another arrow shot in his back. Feeling the true terror, he says he doesn't want to die, but as he says these words it comes to his mind, that if he dies is able to start all over again like a game, but a mental image crosses his mind at that moment. He can't die, and above all he can't forget the face of that girl he lived with for 3 days. He doesn't decide to give up yet, so he takes off the arrow stuck in his back, and flees back to the lobby. Approaching his destination, he is about to reach the portal, when unexpectedly, the protagonist had managed to escape from that hell, and instantly all the wounds that he had began to heal, feeling very relieved by this. But suddenly he wonders what happened to his other companions, so he goes to the community tab, but only to find that the number of people in the infernal difficulty was only 1, all of them had died. The protagonist was shocked not to see any of them in the lobby. He wondered if they had really died, realizing that this tutorial is not an ordinary tutorial. In tears he said that he would never be able to see that pretty girl again. A few hours have passed. The protagonist checks his stats, seeing that he has improved and has obtained a few passive skills, and sees the remaining hours left on the counter. Still hoping to stay alive, he decides to return to the tutorial, and when he returns, he decides to face the flurries of arrows, and decides to check if the first arrow that will hit him will be in his right leg like the other time. And effectively he was right, but suddenly another arrow hits his shield, but thanks to his shield he manages to stop it, and out of nowhere another arrow appears towards his head. The protagonist, as a pro player, manages to dodge it, but the flurry of arrows apparently has no end, and another arrow manages to break the shield of our protagonist, and receives an arrow in one of his crotches. And another one hit his shoulders, and to top it off he receives another arrow directly into his chest, and barely manages to dodge one more arrow. The protagonist, about to die, receives a message that he has leveled up, and had gained an increase in his agility along with his pain tolerance, so he manages to recover, managing to stop an arrow thanks to his sword. And in that he had leveled up his wounds along with his shield had been restored. The protagonist with great determination decides to continue, but suddenly he gets a message that a god had shown interest in him. After a few hours the protagonist manages to climb to level 4, thanks to the experience he has gained from pain tolerance, and as he goes up a level, he manages to recover again. On the way to the path, the arrows no longer represented any danger for the protagonist, dodging them without any problem. But suddenly a trap of 2 crossbows appears on each side, but the protagonist manages to evade them without any problem. It has been 28 days since the prota is in the tutorial, and he had improved his stats, so he goes to a totally dark area, but now he would have to rely completely on his survival instincts, since he could not see any arrow because of the darkness. After receiving an arrow shot, he manages to climb to level 8, so he goes to a door that seems to be the exit. Upon arrival, this comes in a kind of magic well, and getting into this, manages to recover from all his wounds, and once recovered manages to see the big door of the final boss of the floor number 1, and he gets a message that if you are completely sure to face the boss, the protagonist without any hint of fear decides to enter the boss room. And the boss was nothing more and nothing less than a crossbow. But let's remember that protagonist is in the infernal difficulty, so it's not a simple crossbow, and the prota is impressed at the speed of the arrows, which are heading towards him, telling himself that, to defeat the boss, he would have to cross that pool full of lava, and he heads towards the crossbow, dodging and avoiding the flurries of arrows, but suddenly there was fire all around on his back. Those arrows were not just ordinary arrows, but incendiary arrows, and the prota manages to get fire tolerance, and by an oversight the prota loses his shield, and receives 2 more arrows in his back. The crossbow was already ready for its next attack, while the protagonist without hope of defeating the boss manages to see some hallucinations of his former companions. And the prota remembers his life before being sent to the tutorial. He used to have a great life thanks to his hobby of playing video games, that he managed to become a professional gamer, but ended up losing everything since that gamer trampled on the protagonist's pride, causing him to lock himself up for a few years, thinking that his life has been very boring. But now it is different. His heart beats faster as messages come to him, saying to himself that he will not make the same mistake twice. He decides to fight again against the crossbow, and takes off his shirt full of fire, and is willing to defeat the boss. After a series of dodges, the prota manages to cut the crossbow in 2. The prota had finally made it, almost a month to complete the 2nd floor of the tutorial, so he gets a message that he has managed to overcome the floor number 1, and the prota raises his hand exclaiming his great victory. Coming soon, who is this girl that the protagonist meets when leaving the boss room, and what kind of creatures will be waiting for them on floor number 2? That's all, friends. Do not forget to leave your like and comment in the comments, and most importantly subscribe to the channel. I'm Cochito Chao.